started. Great pleasure to welcome you all here for the latest Whitehall Paper launch. The inaugural launch took place in Oslo on Sunday, with the House of Commons yesterday, with another launch here with the formal RUSI launch, and then on Thursday in Washington doing a launch over there, followed by a smorgasbord of further visits and launches around the capitals of Europe. And of course Toronto, which seems to be going to on Friday to launch there. And this considerable international interest in this series, it's the second in a series, this volume, which concerns security in Northern Europe, building on the last Whitehall paper that was released last year, which talks specifically about the Nato command structure, the need for a more maritime-based thinking, and a reaffirmation of the North Atlantic in the title of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. So it was for RUSI an absolute delight when John Olson came back as the editor to say, listen, I've got another idea for another one, how about this? And not only was John able to do that, but he was able to bring in some really high-quality authors, of which we're very lucky to have 3 with us today. What is fascinating about the construct of this book, and you don't have a copy now, those of you members, they will be with you shortly. Otherwise, the publication team have assured me that they will have some outside shortly, and these will be available to you at a beautifully cheap price of £20. You can even get them signed, for which I don't think there's a fee, there's no charges here, no. So you can get them signed and lose their value entirely. These, but this is a really interesting construct. The start of it is by Sir Stu Peach, Air Chief Marshal Sir Stu Peach, who's the senior military man in Nato. And the penultimate piece in it is written by Admiral James Fogo, US Navy, who just finished as pretty much the senior serving mariner in the Alliance. So you have this book-ended series of papers that sit within it, which is divided into 2 sections, more of which John will cover in a minute. But I can heartily recommend it to you, and having read it in the sort of peer review process and all the way through its gestation, what's fascinating is the wider perspective this gives you on individual states who start to voice their own concerns within this. And previously it was just a free nation volume. This expands that considerably. And those views are really important to listen to. And to do that, today, for this launch, we have 4 excellent speakers. John Olson, who is the editor. John, many of you will know, is in the Norwegian Air Force, but he is the defence attaché in London. But he's also an academic in his own right, professor of war studies, with various studies publications behind him, and has been the driving force, the ideas man behind the series, the man who galvanised it. So John will give us an intro to give us some of the overview. John will be followed by Rolf Tanners. Rolf is a professor at IFS, which is the Norwegian Defence University almost. It's the defence think tank in Oslo, and was a director there for 13 years. I mean, it is an enormous amount of corporate knowledge that he brings to the piece, not just reaching through our recent history, where he was one of the key members of the Norwegian inquiry into Afghanistan, but further back, and has this lovely set of corporate knowledge to bring to us as an academic looking at the problem. And complementing Rolf, also from Norway, is Sven Efferstad, who policy director at the Norwegian MOD. I think he's been a Norwegian MOD on the direction 36 years? 38 years. And again, you have that great span of experience that isn't merely caused in the moment of this job, the last 2 years, and where am I going next. So it breaks from what perhaps we in other states would understand by what the civil service feels like. Someone with a longer corporate memory, able to leverage and bring relationships, long-term engagements to bear right across a really wide array of contexts. It's a great place to have him back. And then our last speaker will be Frans Osinger, who is a serving one-star in the Dutch Air Force. But like the others who have government positions, Frans is a deep academic in his own right. He's a professor of war studies in the Netherlands. He's written numerous books and articles, and his chapter in the book, I think, to me, is one of the highlights. The way we're going to skin this is they'll each get a maximum of 10 minutes, no more. And then it's over to you to inquire, dig, play with, chill, get inside their minds and tease them perhaps a little bit. And if you don't, I'll take great pleasure in doing so. So, John, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Peter. May I take the opportunity to thank you and the RUSI team for your professionalism and dedication to security and defense. And also, on a personal note, thank you for your cooperation on the 2 volumes in the Whitehall Paper series, this one and the one we did 18 months ago. This is really appreciated, so thank you to you and your team. Ladies and gentlemen, nice to see you all. Why this publication? We are witnessing a profound shift in the security landscape. Consequently, we need to assess the new situation honestly and critically without fear or favor. We cannot allow ourselves to be complacent. We cannot allow ourselves to be intellectually lazy, because this is important stuff. And this seminar focuses on Direction North, a region that has regained an urgency not seen for at least 3 decades. For the northern region, Russia has re-emerged as the dominant factor for defense planning. This stands in contrast to a couple of decades of out-of-area operations and insurgency, counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. In short, Russia's rhetoric and actions gives us reason for concern. In early 2014, Russia illegally annexed Crimea and encouraged separatist activities in eastern Ukraine. They still do. Russia's military actions reshape boundaries of a major European state in violation of international law. It's a confrontational stance not aligned to the Western values. Moscow's significant numbers of forces on high readiness, reinvestment in high-end capabilities and dual-use infrastructure along the Arctic coast adds urgency to those concerns. Kremlin's military modernization program, with emphasis on long-range precision weapons, represent a major distress for all of Europe and for eastern and northern countries in particular. I've given some instructions that I don't want to touch. Thank you. The Navy is always more competent on this than the Air Force. Many of you are familiar with the Bastion defense concept. As you see on the map, Russia needs sea control of the Kola Peninsula, maneuver freely in the Barents Sea, and protect its bases on land. In terms of strategic depth, it needs sea denial down to the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And heightened submarine activity in the North Atlantic challenges open sea lines of communication between North America and Europe, and the ability to provide transatlantic reinforcement in a potential conflict. This is critical. Russia is not 10 feet tall. Norway does not consider Russia a military threat to Norwegian territorial integrity, but let there be no doubt, Russia must be the dominant factor in our defense planning. So this is the challenge. This new book is about how the Northern Group nations should respond. The Northern Group is the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, and UK. This RUSI Whitehall paper suggests a unified approach in which Northern European countries strengthen cooperations among themselves and reinforce the transatlantic bond to enhance deterrence and collective defense, while at the same time build a constructive relationship with Russia. The prerequisite for a stable and secure Northern Europe is an alliance that combines national and regional efforts with a strong transatlantic bond. Without US commitment, no NATO. And may I say, A Europe whole, free and at peace is important for US security and prosperity. In an attempt to summarize the book in one slide, I believe in the classic ends, ways, means nexus as a useful point of departure. So let's start with the ends. What is our end state objective regarding Russia? It's a tough one. But the big picture is that we would like to have a strategic partnership with a peaceful and prosperous Russia, but not at any price. It requires that Moscow is aligned to democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, the three basic values of the NATO Treaty of 1949. And Kremlin is unlikely to accept this in the short term, but this should nevertheless be our long-term objective and therefore the guidance to our strategy. The ways, the strategy, this book suggests that we revisit NATO in 3D, deterrence, defense, and dialogue. This triad represents the alliance's long-standing strategy, but must be recalibrated and made modern to match the current situation. The challenge is to strengthen the first two elements to enable the third, something that NATO and its key partners can only achieve if they approach Russia from a position of strength. NATO must consider deterrence in the context of today's political military realities, covering the full spectrum from nuclear to conventional to cyber and hybrid. Defense includes a joint fight, a combined fight with updated contingency plans, with a command and control structure that is fit for purpose, and not least an exercise and training regime that strengthens interoperability, readiness, responsiveness, and sustainability. And to ensure resilience, the armed forces of NATO must connect inwards to their own society, to connect the total defense concept with the commercial and other government sectors. It must also look outwards to its partners, to its allies. However, deterrence and defense must be interlinked with dialogue. This book emphasizes that NATO members must seek a constructive dialogue with Moscow through bilateral and multilateral engagements aimed at finding common ground for coexistence in line with a rules-based international order. Dialogue must start with a series of confidence-building measures, such as agreements on arms control, mutual inspections, and regimes for notifications. That is a diplomatic measure with emphasis on predictability, transparency, and accountability. So what about the means? The means to empower NATO in 3D is burden sharing, with emphasis on the 3 Cs: cash, capabilities, and contributions. To ensure continued US leadership and commitment, European allies must increase their defense spending towards the NATO target of 2% of their respective GDPs by 2024, as agreed in the Wales Summit in 2014 and reinforced at the Warsaw Summit in 2016 and Brussels earlier this year. The 2% allocation does not in itself indicate adequate fighting power, but it says a lot about our commitment to Washington and the transatlantic alliance. And as you know, 20% of that money needs to be spent on increasing the defense, the weapon systems to ensure that we have sharp, high-end capabilities that underwrite the strategy of credible deterrence and collective defense. While the European allies must focus on collective defense, and there's nothing more important than that, we also must contribute to fighting terrorism, handling migration, human trafficking, things like this outside Europe. That is part of NATO's large regime for burden sharing. And we believe the combination of the 3Ds and the 3Cs defines both political commitment and military force. It constitutes a comprehensive approach to establishing a theater-wide defense and security framework for Northern Europe as a whole, one that includes NATO's 2 key partners, Sweden and Finland. And should a crisis occur in Northern Europe, there is every reason to believe that the Nordic countries will engage in close cooperation with NATO to enable a shared response. So, friends and colleagues, this ends ways means nexus model is simplistic, as all models are, but it offers a unified approach to security based on the overarching imperative for each NATO member to support each other where and when needed, but to take extra responsibility in its own regional sector, in its own neighborhood. That is the very rationale for the 360-degree approach. That is NATO, that is how we can do better together, and that is the future. Thank you.
Rolf.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This book is about Northern Europe. One could argue that Northern Europe is not one geostrategic entity, at least not according to the conventional thinking. As you know, much of the region can be seen as part of the Central Europe, or at least an extension of it. From such a perspective, the European High North is different, with its own characteristics. It could be seen as part of the maritime domains in the north, the Norwegian Sea, the Barents Seas. In the broader sense, it belongs to the Arctic, an ocean surrounded by 3 continents. And as most of you will know, Russia gives high priority to the Arctic in the economic spheres, and also when it comes to security. They're building an extensive military and non-military, or dual use, I would say, infrastructure along the entire Arctic Rim for offensive and defensive purposes, motivated by hardcore security considerations, and also because of security concerns, search and rescue, things like that. So that's an important starting point when you look to the north, Russia as the key factor. Above that, I would argue that in the longer run, climate change, ice melting, will most likely contribute to transforming the Arctic fundamentally, boosting the exploitation of the extensive resources up there, and also opening up Arctic waterways, including to Asia. Destinational traffic in the next decades, that is in and out, not through the Arctic. We won't expect that much traffic when it comes to that kind of traffic, but in connection with tourism, in connection with oil and gas. There will be a significant increase in destinational traffic in this region in the decades to come. In addition to this impact of climate change as such, I think we must be prepared for the scenario that a more powerful Asia, and of course China in particular, will play a prominent role also in this region and contribute to making it a central part of global geopolitics. What I'm indicating is a future change of paradigm, somewhere down the road. It might take some time, but I think it will come. But we see the contours of this change already, in the sense that China demonstrates an interest in the region. Economically, first of all, just give you 2 examples. The important Chinese investments in the Yamal Peninsula to build the LNG infrastructure with Russia, the Novatek company. Amazing how fast and how successful this project has been, and it relies on Chinese investments. Another example, Greenland, a small and fragile economy. They are about to modernize the airport infrastructure, 3 airports. China is interested in taking part. It has raised some delicate questions about security concerns, the potential that they might have significant influence on politics in Greenland, what might happen to the Thule base. It ended up with the Danish decision to take the costs, significant costs. And the United States has joined Denmark and says they would join as a kind of partnership in building these airports. They give us an indication, those examples of China with a lot of capital, being forward-leaning also in the Arctic. But I would argue that this is the beginning. But what we sense here, especially in Greenland, this small and fragile economy, is a kind of neo-imperialism as we have seen in Africa. Very much the same pattern, I would argue. But this is very much belonging to the future. The situation today and in the foreseeable future is first of all that the main geostrategic characteristic of this region, the High North, is the prominent role of the Northern Fleet, the strategic submarines, and the best in defense, stretching down and beyond the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, as Jon Andreas mentioned. I shall not go into the best in defense as such, just pointing out that the impact of that is that it stands out as a strategic challenge to the linkage between North America and Europe, and hence to the entire security of the entire Northern European region. And that brings me to another perspective than what I started with. From such a perspective, Northern Europe should be seen as a strategic unity because of all these bubbles stretching to the west. And from such a perspective, the Northern European countries have a very strong common interest in deepening their defense cooperation. Another interesting development when it comes to Russia is that it has restored the capacity for theater-scale warfare operations, led by the Joint Strategic Commands directly under the General Staff. Its military posture, and we see it very clearly, is oriented to seizing the strategic initiative. And to achieve this, the posture is optimized for high readiness, quick movement of large forces over long distances. This was demonstrated in connection with Zapad 17, also in the north. Massive transfer, I would say, of resources to the north in connection with that exercise. And of course we saw it in connection with Vostok 18. That is the same pattern. These theater scale capability that they demonstrate in their war planning. So my point here is that in contrast to that, NATO's current mode of thinking is static, symmetric and predictable, especially in the land domain, which leaves very much of the initiative to decide to the Russians when, where and how to act. So while one could argue that NATO has come a long way since 2014, one of my points is that NATO cannot set up a solid defense unless it starts thinking in terms of competitive strategy, capitalizing much more on the strength of the Western nations and exploiting Russia's weaknesses. One example of this is one key part of the package is, of course, within the field of technology and concepts. This should be an advantage for the Western countries. And since you are a maritime nation, you know that one of the key priorities of NATO as of today is to regain its advantage in ASW. And to achieve this, I think one has to make significant improvements in unmanned autonomous systems, stealth and endurance. That's just an example. Another approach to the same question related to being competitive is to see the whole front line in Europe, from the Baltic to the High North, as one integrated theater of operations, and hence incorporate Finland and Sweden in the planning to a greater extent and today, and of course to the extent possible. Just think about the idea of pooling resources when it comes to air defense. If we could come into that situation when the rather strong Swedish Air Force could become part of the Western package, that would make a significant impact on the strategic planning of the West in this region. Just an example. And of course, in line with the very same logic, NATO will have to strengthen further the connection between this front line in Northern Europe and the North Atlantic, making this lifeline much stronger. We are moving in this direction, as you know, and the setup of, or the reform and the strengthening of the command structure is an illustration of that. The re-establishment of the Second Fleet in Norfolk and the strengthening of Markham in this country. So we are moving in that direction, but we have a way to go. In that connection, I would mention that there is an emerging debate about the ambitions as far to forward operations, maritime operations. So today much of the focus has been on the GI-UK gap. I see a debate coming whether NATO should give higher priority to deterring and, if necessary, engaging Russian naval forces in the High North before they enter the Norwegian Sea with significant forces and come into the North Atlantic. Let me also mention that both Britain and Norway can make significant contributions to the common cause. Just to illustrate that by two examples, and these are two important joint efforts, and they are emerging. The first I would mention is, of course, the Norwegian, US and UK effort to build up a strong and important trilateral partnership based on PA aircraft for maritime patrol operations in the North Atlantic, based on very capable aircraft and the synergy coming from that cooperation. The other example I would mention, that's important as well, we see the emergence of a cluster of amphibious forces in the north. The UK, the Dutch Marines have trained for Arctic warfare in Norway for almost 50 years. This activity will now be concentrated in Inner Troms, in northern Norway, where they can train and exercise together with the US Marine Corps and the Norwegian Armed Forces. And this will prepare them to a very great extent for high intensity operations as well, and not only for training. So there is a huge and interesting potential related to these clusters emerging in northern Norway. I think it is important what your Marines, I think, are about to do to develop long-term plans for this engagement in the north, to optimize the resources, and also to do it since you will now interact more extensively with a number of other nations, so you should have a long-term plan for what you're doing. I would also mention that I would like to see that some of the equipment be prepositioned in Norway, as the Americans do, and as you did at an earlier stage. I think that have many advantages to reduce the transfer time, to reduce the burden of escorting convoys, and so on and so forth. Leave it there. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to say a few words about the Nordic region, and for the time being I'm chairing the political military steering committee of the NORDEFCO, which is the Nordic Defence Cooperation. This is not an organization as such. It has no permanent secretariat. It has a rotational chair. Norway is chairing in 2018, and it has three pillars. One is operations and training, and policy. The second one is armament, and the third one is military capability. I will go through some of the things which are happening within the NORDEFCO system, but first let me say a few words about the region as such. In today's security policy environment, I believe the geostrategic position of the 5 Nordic countries is very important. because the transatlantic link between North America and Western Europe, and also for the security and stability in the Baltic Sea region, where Russia and Western Europe meet. I will not dwell on the traditional differences in security orientation between the 5 Nordic countries, but simply stress that Sweden and Finland, who we regarded to be neutral during the Cold War, are not neutral anymore in that original sense. With their full membership in the European Union from 1994, they took a long step away from neutralism, and paragraph 47 and paragraph 222 in the Lisbon Treaty give a clear expression of this. All members will receive assistance and also provide assistance to other members of the European Union if they are attacked. Finland and Sweden have also signed host-nation agreements with NATO and participate in NATO's response forces and the British-led Joint Expeditionary Force. So all 5 Nordic countries are increasingly involved in larger-scale Western defense and security arrangements. Still, we are 3 countries in the north inside the European Union, where Norway and Iceland are close partners, and Sweden and Finland are military non-aligned, still, but close partners with NATO through the enhanced operational partnership, which is very substantial indeed. Respecting these differences, it still has proven to be possible to develop close military cooperation in the Nordic area. In 2009, Ministers of Defense established the NORDEFCO framework for Nordic defense cooperation. So what have we achieved since 2009? We have well-coordinated considerations and policies on most issues regarding the security situation in our area. We consult closely and discuss all security developments in Europe, with a particular emphasis on the High North and the Baltic Sea region. Together, we are able to exert some influence on our partners in NATO and the EU. In addition, the Nordic cohesion gives us better basis for domestic discussions, and it also provides more robustness in order to withstand pressure from foreign powers. Training and exercises amongst the Nordic military forces have established a good interoperability based on NATO standards. Such interoperability makes it possible to act militarily together on short notice in all kinds of operations. We are preparing to exchange air surveillance data, to establish procedure for alternate landing bases, and we are also establishing procedures for easy access in order to facilitate border crossing without delay in the Nordic region. The cross-border Air Force training conducted in northern Scandinavia has proven to be most successful and effective. The semi-annual air exercise Arctic Challenge provides large airspace and excellent training experience for participating forces. This will be expanded next year to a flag-level exercise and probably the biggest air exercise in Europe, together with the US Air Force, Europe. We also see this as we speak when the Trident Juncture exercise with more than 50,000 participants, people are involved. More than 6,500 soldiers participate from the other Nordic countries in this NATO Article 5 exercise. We also cooperate closely in a number of international operations in Afghanistan, on the Balkans, in Africa and the Middle East. Together we provide capacity building in Georgia. Each of the Nordic countries have very limited resources for deployed operations, but together we can make a difference. We have also established secure communications between our 5 countries. So we use secure VTC on a daily basis to prepare meetings of different sorts. In addition, we will use this to consult and discuss sensitive issues that may arise which require consideration of common activities. There is also an ambition to strengthen the cooperation in materiel acquisition and development in military capability more generally. This was originally seen as a major motivation for Nordic defense cooperation, but so far it has not produced very good results. We are now looking at establishing a cooperation in military capabilities on the use of space and also in unmanned autonomous systems. Looking forward, the Nordic countries agree on how we will take the Nordic defence cooperation further. We agree that Nordic cooperation will continue to be a supplement to what we do in NATO, the European Union and other international organizations. It will not become an independent alternative for any of the countries. All Nordic countries, also Sweden and Finland, will continue to promote closer transatlantic partnership. We will continue to promote opportunities for Nordic non-members in NATO and EU respectively, and we will use the NORDEFCO to strengthen cooperation with the 3 Baltic states. With a more complicated and difficult security situation in Northern Europe, our focus will be directed towards deterrence and defense in order to provide peace and stability in our region. In this regard, we will also discuss possibilities for more cooperation in civil emergency, total defense, and security of supply. All in all, I believe we are gradually strengthening deterrence and defense in our region. The revitalization of collective defense in NATO is a major factor in this regard, and a stronger US involvement through the EDI and a more active UK military engagement are major factors. In addition, the increased military cooperation amongst the Nordic countries is important and necessary. I believe there is a potential for considerable expansion of this cooperation, both bilaterally between each of the 5 Nordic countries and in the wider NORDEFCO forum. I believe that in the future any serious security crisis in Northern Europe will affect all Nordic countries, and therefore we will be prepared to handle such crises together within a wider international framework. This is a good basis for further development of the Nordic Defence Cooperation. Thank you very much.
Brandon.
Right. It's great to be back here, ladies and gentlemen. I believe it's been a decade ago that we discussed European defence after a publication of a RUSI publication by Julia Lindy-French, I believe. We had a good discussion with guys like Lawrence Friedman. But I must admit that we are a decade hence now. I'm not sure we have made very much progress when it comes to European defence. So let me pour some cold water on this whole idea. First of all, the Netherlands, I'm giving you a Netherlands perspective, a critical perspective, not necessarily the MOD or the perspective of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Netherlands actually is quite supportive of all these activities of the Northern Group. In June we hosted the Northern Group, we are part of it. Currently there are 2,000 troops of the Netherlands Armed Forces participating in Trident Juncture. I was actually trained as an F-16 pilot in the north as part of the Ace Mobile Force that we had during the Cold War. We share the North Sea, of course, so it comes natural for the Netherlands to support this policy and to try to raise awareness for the strategic relevance of the northern area, the North Atlantic and the Arctic. Well, I would suggest that it's so important we invited our royal family, and they're across the street right now visiting the British royal family. The thing is, though, and that's why I'm invited here, and that's why I was invited to contribute to this chapter. Where you stand depends on where you sit. Or was it the other way around? You will find that not everyone in Europe, not all countries, share the same opinion concerning the relevance of the North. It's not central to all. The second element I'm going to want to stress is that we have seen a drastic erosion of military capabilities throughout Europe for a variety of reasons. And understanding the cause of that, right, will help you appreciate the problems that NATO and the European Union as a military actor is facing right now. And finally, I want to emphasize the inertia that is prevalent among all European defense forces, despite their best efforts to expedite improving military capabilities. Right, first, it's not central to all. Northern Europe is important, but as we've seen over the past decade, there is a divergence of opinion on where the strategic priorities lie for many European countries. Portugal isn't necessarily very interested in what happens in the Baltics. 40% of the German population might not consider an attack on the Baltics an Article 5 situation. I'm just trying to illustrate. There are different opinions on this. The southern part of Europe, the Mediterranean, Italians and Spanish and the Greeks are really focusing on the refugee problem, and I think rightfully so. Even in my country, we've been more worried about the refugee problem than the direct threat of Russia. I had all of a sudden, in my street in the Netherlands, we welcomed a refugee center, which created a lot of local political upheaval. But even in 2010, when NATO developed the strategic concept, we discovered that for Eastern European countries, the raison d'être of NATO is the Article 5. Whereas for the United States, the raison d'être of NATO was the ability of NATO to act as a global cup, i.e. Operate at strategic distances. In 2011, Libya, only 14 of 28 nations in Europe participated to stop the humanitarian crisis emerging out there. And even in the response to Russia, you will find different approaches. Some countries are somewhat reluctant, actually, to point a finger at Russia. This might be due to the Russian influence itself, or because of Russian interdependencies, economic interdependencies. We see it also in the policy towards maintaining the sanction regime towards Russia. It's a fragile sanctions regime. Nationalism, the emerging nationalism in various countries in Europe also doesn't really help NATO in the EU, because most of these parties tend to be anti-institutionalists and anti-internationalists. Finally, it is quite a tradition within NATO that the North and the South and the East and West are actually quite different. The West looks towards the Atlantic, the East looks towards Russia, the North looks towards the North, and the South looks towards the Mediterranean and Africa. That's where you stand depends on where you sit, I guess. So, not central to all. Second one is the erosion of military capabilities. We've been engaged in Europe, mostly for the past 25 years, in humanitarian intervention operations. They weren't wars of necessity, they were wars of choice. They didn't revolve around existential interest of most of the countries. It was a sort of risk management. It also translated into a willingness to cut back on defense spending quite drastically. We were involved in state building, counterinsurgency, and counterterrorism, and this really meant that most of the investments were towards army capabilities to the detriment of maritime and air power capabilities across the board. It also translated in a significant loss in expertise, knowledge, and practice in conducting high-intensity warfare, joint warfare, Article 5 and conventional deterrence activities. It's been quite a while since NATO actually practiced nuclear deterrence exercises. So NATO actually lost quite a bit of its raison d'être in the current strategic context. Now, focusing on my country, just to give you a flavor of what this all meant. We went from 120,000 troops to 53,000. We used to have 235 F-16s, we're now down to 65. We used to have 935 tanks, we now have 0. We used to have a squadron of maritime patrol aircraft, which we desperately need these days. Now we're down to 0. Actually, it wasn't such a long time ago that some people on the left side of the political spectrum in my country started to debate whether we would need an armed forces that was capable of fighting high-intensity warfare at all. And someone actually suggested, shouldn't we just abolish the Air Force? As an airman, that didn't go down well, really. But I'm just laying out the debate that just before 2014, in the middle of the economic and financial crisis in Europe, was bandied about. We had serious problems. And then came 2014, and several think tanks in the Netherlands considered that year a watershed event. We had Russia, the emergence of ISIS, the refugee crisis, and we have had the downing of the MH17 in the Netherlands. And everyone was aware that Article 5, conventional deterrence, nuclear deterrence, collective defense was high on the agenda again. It really amounted to a paradigm shift. NATO had to shift from crisis management to collective defense again. And then we run into a bit of a problem, not just in the Netherlands, but in Europe. We've seen a flurry of initiatives in NATO and the EU to try to solve the capability gap that everyone became aware of since 1999. We had the Defense Capabilities Initiative, the Prague Commitment Capabilities Initiative, and we had the Smart Defense initiatives. And all of these initiatives, no matter how worthwhile, haven't produced that much when it comes to real new capabilities. It is very hard for European countries to come together and agree you have to spend more money and spend it smartly. That's on an international basis. On a national basis, you will find that there's now a willingness within the cabinet to spend more on defense. We have a budget right now of 7.25 billion euro, that's all. And we would like to go to 2%. We're down to 1.2% right now of the GDP. We'd love to go to 2%. But that would actually involve adding another 6 billion euro to our defense budget. That will not happen for very good reasons. One reason is that even managing the increase of 1.5 billion euro that we've just been able to welcome is posing some problems. We can't spend it soon enough. We don't have sufficient contractors to spend it, very simply. Another reason is that we would love to fill up again the brigades. We love to expand the army, but also fill in the job vacancies of the army and the Air Force and the Navy. We have about 6,000 to 8,000 job vacancies, which amounts to 10% of the entire force. So even if you want to expand very rapidly, you run into structural problems. The Army, the Air Force and Navy have wish lists, of course, vis-à-vis the anti-access and area denial problems that the Russians pose to us right now. But we discovered that just maintaining readiness and sustaining the current force that we have requires 1 billion. So that only leaves you with about 500 million of the 1.5 increase. The Army wants to have its tanks back, it wants to have an increase in artillery capabilities, transport, how to get there in the first place. It focuses on the Baltics. The Air Force wants desperately to have more than 37 F-35s. It wants to have 65. Also to protect the Army going to the Baltics and to protect them once in the Baltics. We are participating as part of the enhanced forward presence, as a part of the VGTF force. So the Army and the Air Force is focusing on the Baltics. The Navy wants to have its submarines replaced, its frigates modernized and replaced, and it will do so. But if you tally it all up, that amounts to 6 billion worth of wish lists. So we have a bit of a problem, budgetary. We also see that there's divergence among the services where the focus should lie. The Navy is focusing on the North Atlantic, the Arctic, the Baltic Sea, and the North Sea. The Army and the Air Force, however, are really focusing on the Baltics. That's where their prime mission lies. And then all of a sudden, we saw the publication of the newly integrated security strategy of the Netherlands, being published this year. The first in its kind in the Netherlands to have an integrated security strategy. And there you will find that our interests aren't really just in the north. You will find that this document contains a whole catalogue of problems: refugees, human rights, climate change, protection of the Caribbean, NATO, EU. So all of a sudden, the MOD too has to somewhat fill in those interests. You know, has to protect those interests, which now include the Caribbean. So you see that our armed forces, small as we are somewhat stretched. Well, our predicament isn't necessarily all that different from the Belgians, from the Germans, I wouldn't say the French, but Bulgaria, Hungary, and all those countries. So where does it leave us? The good thing is there is no uncertainty in the international security environment anymore. Everybody who says the future is uncertain, that doesn't apply really to defense planning. We know pretty well what our armed forces should be prepared for. That is the arc of instability. That was the focus of the past 2 decades. That is Africa, the Middle East and the Far East, Caribbean perhaps a bit for us. But it's also now Article 5 operations, nuclear conventional deterrence. Russia has actually taken away the last remnants of uncertainty for defense planners. Thank you very much for that. But still, the capability gap remains to a large extent. So we still have a long way to go. And for most countries, it will be a decade before we actually achieve the 2% spending that we pledged in 2014, a decade after the annexation of the Crimea. And if Russia was the only problem, that would be okay somewhat. However, we are debating these problems in a much wider context where the Western liberal order is actually at stake right now and being challenged from a variety of sources, from a variety of sides. And you will find lots of books focusing on the demise of liberalism, and that is not a prospect I really want to anticipate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, fascinating insights, and you sit there and you think, when I was writing the British chapter, why is this so important to us in the UK? We bang on internally in RUSI. We have lots of meetings about the Joint Expeditionary Force, framework nations, what it means to have Finland and Sweden, what's the relationship with Poland, and people who work in the sort of countering violent extremism area of RUSI sort of wander in and say, no, you should be focusing on the Middle East and Syria and the South China Sea. And this area is not really understood, nor is the history of this relatively recently. You go back to Dr. Liam Fox, who got the UK, somewhat deliberately perhaps, engaged in this northern group, who stimulated, greater interaction. You now have Parliament, which effectively has vetoed any ability of the Ministry of Defence to do any kind of curtailment of amphibious capability. You have a recent report on thin ice by the Defence Committee again. The Arctic strategy coming out as a result. The UK will have an Arctic military strategy, which I'm reassured will be neither military only nor fully a strategy, so that's truly a British approach. But the British government and the MOD has been deeply engaged in this northern group, possibly more so than anywhere else, and in a very, very serious, deliberate fashion. When you look at how it is allocating what little forces it has left, it is gapping British military deployments to the Mediterranean. It is cutting back on overseas deployments perhaps to Northern Africa. It is not doing EU missions anymore. Where are all these assets going? Well, they're not here. You see the increased deployment tempo by individual servicemen and women going through the roof. And where are they going? They're going up to Norway, to Sweden. There's submarines going under the ice. They're minesweepers, HMS Ocean, Apaches, enhanced forward presence, all around the Baltic. This is the contested space in British strategy, and yet very few people seem to be aware of it. It's as if it's some kind of secret that people don't want to let the public know about. But it is gaining a lot of momentum at very senior levels, particularly in the political sphere. And if one was being slightly cynical, you could say that the military are dragging their feet a little bit in this, because it doesn't feel like the kind of battle that we want to be fighting, which is at great range, a safe distance from the UK, in a kind of scenario that suits an aircraft carrier and 12 or 24 F-35s. This doesn't feel like that, because it's not. But this is, with no mistake, the engagement space. So, you have a rare opportunity to go at these guys who I think are the most pragmatic and honest authors around, bearing in mind that several of them are government employees or draw their core funding from the government. So, over to you for a few minutes. Yes, please.